Hi, thank you for participating in this webinar on trade law. I hope that it's both interesting and helpful. My name is Mary Kostopoulos and I'm an attorney here at Mumkus McCluskey. Trade law is composed of two very different aspects of the law: importation of goods and the exportation of goods and technology. Both are very highly regulated industries. However, they're regulated for very different reasons. Importation, the regulations are mostly around revenue collection. The regulations are highly revenue collection driven. So customs collects every year over $37 billion a year from customs duties. So although there are many agencies that regulate, it cannot be, the significance of the revenue cannot be minimized. Exportation, on the other side, the regulations are highly driven on security and controls of information leaving the United States. So the import agencies, there are a number of agencies that regulate the importation of goods. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection regulates every single item that comes into the United States. The other agencies include the Food and Drug Administration, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Food Safety and Inspection Service, APHIS. These regulate fruits, vegetables, poultry, eggs, meats. Their interest is in ensuring that food is not contaminated. Their interest is in ensuring that drugs do not enter the United States that have not been tested. Customs has a lot of these interests too, and there is a lot of overlap, but customs interest is also in determining what duty rates are owed and ensuring that those duties are actually collected. So the Customs Modernization Act of 1993 shifted the liability to importers to use reasonable care in disclosing information to customs at the time of the entry of their goods. So what that means is that customs is tasked with a shared responsibility with the importing community. Customs provides information around the laws and regulations to the importers, and the importers have to stay informed and understand those laws in order to comply and provide the necessary information. So what Customs does is issue informed compliance documents on their website. They give seminars. They make all of their rulings, or many of their rulings, public. Where something is confidential, they will just block out the relevant confidential information, but otherwise importers have access to the information that they need in order to then comply with the regulations. Customs duties are based on three main factors: the classification of the goods that are being entered, the valuation of those goods being entered, and the country of origin of those goods. The Harmonized Tariff Schedule is put together by the World Customs Organization. It has over 200 countries participating, and what it does is classify all goods that are part of international commerce into 99 chapters. To be specific, it's 96 chapters because Chapter 77 is reserved, and the last two chapters are country-specific, so those are specifically US chapters. So all items fall into the 96, and they are of increasing sophistication. So for example, Chapter 10 is cereal, Chapter 84, nuclear reactors, and these can all be found online. You can click into the relevant chapter and look up whatever specific item you want to classify. Importers can self-classify. They can work with a broker to classify. They can work with an attorney to classify. They can also request a binding classification ruling from customs. And any disputes that arise regarding classification can be addressed with customs. This is what one page out of the what's called HTSUS looks like, the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States. This is Chapter 18, Cocoa and Cocoa Preparations. So you will see in the first column the HTSUS number to 8 digits. Those 8 digits are the same worldwide. The next column are the US specific subcategory, the following 2 digits. And then you'll see the article description. So someone who is importing, who is familiar with their product, could use this to classify. Of course, there are many notes and explanatory notes and rulings issued by customs that help. So it's important to have an understanding of the general body of law also. Once a classification has been determined, the second factor that must be considered is the actual valuation of the goods being entered. So all goods must be entered, and that valuation must be placed on the customs entry documents. There's a hierarchy of methodologies used to appraise the merchandise, and here it is. It's transaction value first, then transaction value of identical goods, then similar goods, then deductive value, computed value, and finally the fallback method. So deductive, and we'll get to all of these, deducted and computed value can be switched, although they must be switched at the time of entry. So if an importer chooses to use computed rather than deducted, he cannot attempt to enter with deducted and then decide that the computed value is a better determination for him and try to switch it. So transaction value is the favored method. This is the price actually paid or payable for the goods when sold for export into the country of importation, plus certain costs. And those costs include packing costs, selling commissions, assists, to the extent that those additional costs are not already added to the value of the goods on the actual purchase order. Certain factors are also excluded from the transaction value: international shipping charges, customs duties, further assembly done by the actual seller but upon entry into the United States. So an assist. Assists are provided by the importer of the actual merchandise into the United States at a reduced or free cost to the seller. That is not, and that amount cannot be included or is not included in the actual transaction value. So if an assist is already incorporated in the transaction value, it does not get added. If, however, an importer purchases, for example, 1,000 widgets at $10 each, without including the cost of a $500 mold, that mold would have to be included in the value, in the transaction value. And assists are apportioned reasonably and in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. So there are a number of different ways to deal with assists, and they're very fact-driven. So where the assist is provided, how much of the assist or the benefit of the assist is destined to the U.S. Customs territory, how much of it goes to another country, what is the useful life of that assist. It's very, very detail driven. If transaction value cannot be used, the next is transaction value of identical merchandise, and then transaction value of similar merchandise. The next one is deductive value. So the deductive value is the resale price in the U.S. of importation of goods with deductions for certain items, including commissions or profits made with the sale of similar goods, value of further processing, transportation costs, and customs duties. So this is the next method of appraising that can be used if the transaction values cannot be used. And as I mentioned earlier, if an importer does not want to use the deductive, they have the option of using the computed value. Computed value. So this is the sum of the materials, fabrication, and other processing, profits and general expenses, assists, and packing costs. So this is the next value, the next way to compute the actual appraised value of the merchandise. And all of this information is provided on the customs entry forms at the time that goods are entered into the United States. First sale for export. So this is a way for importers to use an earlier value for the goods rather than the value paid to a middleman. This allows the purchaser to pay based on the price that a middleman pays of the manufacturer rather than what they pay to the middleman. And this is based on a few factors. They both have to be bona fide sales. The goods have to be destined for the United States at the time of the original sale from the manufacturer to the middleman. And the manufacturer's prices must be at arm's length. So the way to work with it, you provide Customs and Border Protection with documentation demonstrating all of this, and they will provide you with, and they will provide an importer with permission to enter into this program. Country of origin is the third factor that is taken into consideration in order to determine what the duty of a good what a duty should be assessed on a good. So the country of origin for non-free trade agreement items. It's goods wholly obtained in one particular country. That's obviously not difficult to determine. If corn is grown in Indiana, then obviously that is U.S. corn. Or goods that are substantially transformed, resulting in a change in name, character, and use in that other country. Now, more and more goods fall under the second category of substantial transformation because widget component parts are assembled in multiple factories in multiple countries. So an article that consists of materials from more than one country is the product of the last country in which it has been substantially transformed into a new and different article of commerce. with a name, character, and use distinct from that of the article or articles from which it was transformed. So if cotton is grown in one country, woven into a textile in a second country, and then sewn into an article of clothing in the third, that would be a fact-specific case that would be determined based on the article of clothing where the last country of substantial transformation is. Where free trade agreements do not apply, because free trade agreements have their own rules. So we're going to go back to the Harmonized Tariff Schedule page that we looked at earlier, which provided for the multiple columns. So the columns that are going to be on the far right are the normal trade relations columns and the column 2 columns. The columns that are going to be on the far right are going to be column 1, thank you. So the rates of duty in the last 3 columns. Column 1, which is the column 3rd from the right, and the column 2nd from the right. Those are all for normal trade relations countries. The first one, which is general, those are for non-preferential rates. Those are countries for which we do not have free trade agreements. The second one, the special, are countries with which we do have free trade agreements. And if you look down to the last column where we actually have a duty rate assessed, you will see MX and CA. Those are the designations for the NAFTA countries. A is also a very commonly used free trade agreement. It's GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, and that is with 123 countries currently, but only about 5,000 articles are actually covered by those. And then column 2, the one on the far right, that is currently only 2 countries, Cuba and North Korea, although those change every few months, every few years, depending on what regime is in power where. So free trade agreements. The United States currently has 14 free trade agreements in force, and 24 are currently being proposed. Eligibility in each of these is very different. Each one is drafted with specific rules and specific tariff shifts, but for the most part, the same factors are considered. A tariff shift, which means that goods have changed from one classification to another, and or meeting some required minimal percentage of regional value, either regional value cost of materials or actual processing costs in that region. And in addition, they must be shipped directly from a qualifying country into the United States. There are, as I said, 14 free trade agreements. Each of them has different specific requirements. So this is a very general, high-level analysis on those free trade agreements. Once the classification has been determined and the valuation of the goods has been determined and the country of origin has been determined, the duty rate can be determined and is paid to customs. Another requirement is that the goods must be marked as their country of origin, and the marking must be legible and permanent enough for the ultimate purchaser to be made aware of the goods' origin. So if a product is coming in made in Guatemala, it must say made in Guatemala. If it's made in France, it must say made in France. In the United States, we'll see something that says made in the USA. That is not a customs rule. That is their local, that is their advertisement. That is something that they want to label when that is a good that is being used in the United States. If it's a good that's being exported from the United States, that is not a U.S. customs requirement. That is a foreign country's importation requirement, similar to our requiring foreign items to be labeled upon entry into the United States. And the way to think about this requirement is to think that it has to be labeled for the ultimate purchaser. So if we're talking about something like American cheese, which it's sold in a crate to a grocery store, and then in packages of multiple slices are sold to individuals, and then each of those individual slices is again repackaged. Because you and I are the ultimate purchasers of those packages of cheese, that package of cheese must be labeled, not the individual slice, and the box doesn't really benefit us. We need to have the package labeled. But country of origin marking can be determined on an item-by-item basis, because obviously there are different end users in different industries. Disputes. Disputes regarding classification, valuation, country of origin, markings, they all are resolved by the Office of International Trade and Regulations in Washington, D.C., and appeal to the Court of International Trade in New York. That is a very high-level review of import law. Export law is very different, and I think it's important to note that when people import goods into the United States, they must face customs and speak with customs about the necessary paperwork and the necessary requirements. Exportation, which is similarly very heavily regulated, is different in that it's very broadly defined, but it's common for exporters to not realize that they are being regulated and that there are controls around their information and what they're allowed to share, both in the United States and out of the United States. So let's begin with the definition of exportation. An exportation, it can be of goods, software, or technology, regardless of mode of transportation. It can be by plane, it can be by individual, it can be by email, it can be showing someone a screenshot. And an exportation includes shipping to U.S. subsidiary or parent or related entity abroad. It can include transshipments through the U.S., so something that comes from another country into the United States, however brief, and then leaves from the United States to a third party. Even though that was never sourced in the US, it comes into the US, so by leaving the US, it's an exportation. Re-exportation to a third party. So this is goods that are sent from the United States into Europe, and then from Europe to a country that is embargoed by the United States, but which is not embargoed by the European country that was the middleman. Those are all exportations that are bound by US controls. And then finally, deemed exportation, which is to a foreign national, and that can still be on US soil. So it's possible, and we'll speak about this in a little while, but it's possible to export to someone in the United States without ever leaving your office. Similar to importation, exportation is controlled by many different agencies. Department of Defense and State Departments they control and they regulate around munitions, sensitive military goods, defense articles. Companies that are typically controlled by these agencies are not unaware of the regulations. On the other hand, the Department of the Treasury and the Department of Commerce often include companies that are unaware of the export requirements. So I will speak at the end about the Department of Treasury, but that's really, they enforce economic sanctions. So with them, it's just taking a look to make sure that you're not actually paying money or providing any kind of payment to anyone outside of the United States or in the United States that's controlled. Department of Commerce, on the other hand, the Bureau of Industry and Security regulates dual-use goods and requires certain licenses to provide information or technology to people for goods that are considered dual use. And dual use is goods that have both a commercial purpose and also some sort of military purpose. And unknowing violations of this can be prosecuted criminally. So it's important to have an understanding of this. So the first step is classifying the technology or the actual items that are being exported. And so you do that by obtaining the ECCN, the Export Control Classification Number. It's a 5-character classification. And if you have a dual-use item that does not specifically fall within one of the classifications, then it's considered EAR 99. It is still regulated, but no license is required unless it meets one of the other, which we'll speak about in a few minutes, requirements. So how do you obtain the 5-character classification? So you can either look at these list of categories and you start with this and look at where your product falls under this list. Cross-check it also with this product group, and that will give you the first 2 of the 5 characters. The last 3 characters will be based on the actual notes in the Commerce Control List. So you can look through the Commerce Control List to see where your product falls. The other way that you could start the process is by going to the actual index at the end of the Commerce Control List and looking up specific code words in that index that might give you an idea of where within the ECCN your product could fall. I'm going to give you a couple examples of common ECCN. Well, the first is a common ECCN. This is 4A994, computers, electronic assemblies, and related equipment not otherwise controlled. And this is the exact language there. So this one has a license requirement of AT, and we're going to get to that in a minute, but that's anti-terrorism. This is your typical laptop. This is the laptop you take on a flight. This is the laptop that no one's going to put it in your luggage, but this is your typical laptop that you may send to a subsidiary in another country, some computers, etc. This, on the other hand, is computers for fingerprint equipment, 4A980. They are right next to each other in the actual code. This one has a license requirement of CC and AT. These are the various controls. So you see CB, chemical and biological weapons, NP, nuclear nonproliferation, NS, national security, and then the last 2 on that list were the 2 that we just saw. So anti-terrorism, which both of those examples were controlled for, and crime control, which only the second one was. All countries are categorized into these 4 categories, right? Regime members, less restricted, countries of concern, and terrorists supporting. You take the actual code that is provided for the licenses after your classification in the ECCN, and you cross it against this commerce control country chart. So I have given you 4 countries as an example. And if you look across, AT, which was your typical laptop, is only, in this example, is only required a license to go to Sudan, not to the other countries on this particular list. On the other hand, the CC designation requires a license for Brazil, China, and Sudan, but not the United Kingdom. Each particular classification is given a code at the end for which countries it is controlled to. And then if there's an X in the box on the country chart, then a license must be obtained or a license exception must be used. So if there is no X on the country code list, and if the product is actually an EAR 99, you do not need a license. Or if a license exception applies, you do not need a license. Otherwise, you do need a license, and you can obtain a license using the online program. BIS has a very good program, SNAP-R. You can do it online. Here are 4 examples of the license exceptions. So these are, for example, RPL, servicing and replacement of parts and equipment. Something can be controlled and require a license to be exported out of the United States, but then require some sort of replacement part. Those replacement parts can then be sent without the actual license. And what you do is on the export paperwork where the AES, which is the form that you use upon export, you provide the actual classification, ECCN, and then you provide the license exception that is applicable. It's important that this is based on the exporter certification. It's important that you keep all of the paperwork that applies to these license exceptions, and that you meet all of the record-keeping requirements. And they're specific to each exception, so it's worth looking up each of them and making sure that you meet those requirements. If you have a product that does not require a license, or you have obtained the license, or if you are EAR 99 and do not require a license, that still doesn't mean that you can export everything that your technology or your goods outside of the United States without doing this next step, which is confirming that the specific recipient is not controlled. There are these lists of parties of concern, and you can find this on the Bureau of Industry and Security's website. They provide, this is a complete list as of today. These lists change, and they are constantly being updated. So the first 3 are the Bureau of Industry and Security's list. The next 2 are the State Department, and then the last one is OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which was the Treasury Department. That's the one that I mentioned at the beginning. It is important that anyone you are working with outside of the United States, or any deemed exportation, which we'll speak about in a moment, is screened against each of these lists, and that records are kept showing that you screened on this particular date. If someone is on one of these lists and you work with them, you send them money, you send them goods, then your name enters the unverified list, making it harder to work with you going forward. Or it could, it's not guaranteed that it will, but that is certainly a risk. So it is very worth following the screening process. Then if someone is not, you conduct all of these screens, and these are not very difficult to do. So you can go on the website and you can download it in a PDF or HTML, and you can run a search on each of these for the names. If someone is not on one of these lists, you should still get an end user certification. In your agreements, you should have an end user certification included in your contracts in dealing with these. And this basically says that you are exporting to this person, and that this entity is going to understand the regulations and is also going to comply with the regulations. So this is just an example of the sort of language that should be included in an agreement in dealing with people outside of the United States, with entities or with foreign nationals within the United States who are not U.S. citizens. So this just basically says that you have a responsibility to understand and comply with all of the export controls. So a deemed exportation. So this is releasing controlled technology to foreign nationals within the United States. So we said that exporting goods outside of the United States is an export that can be controlled. Well, actually sharing information and technology that falls within the ECCN with someone in the United States who is not a citizen, who does not have a green card holder, and who has specific visas, and it's by specific information, by specific classified information, can be considered an exportation that requires license to that individual's home country or country of most recent permanent residency. So it is worth knowing who you're sharing information with, even within the United States. So casual exporters of goods and technology may feel comfortable self-classifying and screening on the various lists, but companies that export more regularly should have export compliance programs. The key elements of an export compliance program, BIS provides 9 key elements. Management commitment, which is in the form of a statement explaining the significance and the importance of export controls. A risk assessment, where the company actually files their ECCNs. They look at how they're controlled, to what countries, who they typically transact with. A written program, a written export management compliance program, and then training of specific employees, so those employees both understand the laws and have a commitment to ongoing training as these change regularly. Screenings and checks, so those lists, screening those lists on a regular basis depending on the actual goods and services that are being provided, and also based on the industry and countries that we're working with. Record-keeping requirements, which record-keeping requirements are different based on the classifications, based on the exceptions, many different factors. Export compliance monitoring, which are self-evaluations. A system for reporting violations, and a way to taking corrective actions. I hope this webinar has been helpful and interesting. These are both very heavily regulated fields. They're just regulated for different reasons. If you have any specific questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.